The bell in the west tower struck the half-hour, and then it stopped striking anything at all, because the man whose duty it was to ring it had already run from his post toward the smoke. I was on the forecourt gate when it began, and I will tell it the way I saw it, because too many people have since told it the way they wished they had seen it. My name is Guardsman Owen Furrers, and I have stood the palace watch for 11 years, and in all that time I had never once seen Halvard Renne break his stillness. He was the oldest of us on the wall, the one the young ones watched to learn how a man holds a line with nothing but his own spine. If you had asked me that morning which of the king's guard would run into a burning wing of the palace to bring out a 6-year-old, I would have said Halvard without a breath of doubt, and I would have been the only one, because everyone else thought him a statue with a heartbeat, and I knew him for something warmer under the wool. It was the 3rd hour after noon on a gray, still day in the last of the harvest season. The Kingdom of Eldermoor had brought in its wheat, and the royal house of Harrogate had opened the east wing for the season's audience, so the forecourt was busier than usual. Carriages, a delivery of pressed apples, 2 clerks arguing over a ledger, a knot of visitors from the market district come to see the changing of the watch. Ordinary noise. The kind of afternoon that fools you into thinking nothing will ever happen. Then the smell reached the gate. It was not wood smoke, which the palace kitchens threw off all day and which we no longer noticed. It was sharper, meaner, the smell of something that was not meant to burn, burning. Lamp oil and old varnish and dry timber that had been drying for 200 years. I lifted my head, and I saw it. A thin brown ribbon climbing from a window of the east wing, from the upper floor where the family's private rooms were, and even as I looked the ribbon thickened into a rope and the rope into a column, and a woman in the forecourt screamed one word that turned the whole afternoon on its edge. Fire. I have thought about that scream many times since. It was not the word that froze people. It was the direction of it up toward the private floor, where the household knew the children rested in the afternoon. And of the children, everyone's mind went at once to the same one, the smallest, the one the whole palace had quietly decided was theirs to keep safe. Prince Bram, 6 years old, the king's youngest grandson, a boy who could not yet reach the door handles in his own rooms without standing on his toes. Halvard was already moving. I want to be exact about this because it matters. He did not hesitate. There was no moment where the disciplined man weighed the rules and then chose to break them. He was posted at the base of the east stair, and the instant the smoke showed at that window he was through the door and gone, and I heard his voice come back down the stone, not a shout, a command, level as a plumb line, clear the forecourt, send for the fire watch, no one else on the stair. And then the smoke swallowed the sound of him. I broke my own post to follow the order he had thrown back at me, which is the guardsman's paradox. To obey a man, you must sometimes leave the spot you swore to hold. I got the gate open wide, and I got the crowd moving out of it, and I sent the fastest of the market boys running for the fire watch on the river road, and all the while the column of smoke over the east wing was turning the gray sky browner, and somewhere above me a good man was climbing into it. The east wing of the palace was old. That is the thing outsiders never understood about that day. The public rooms, the audience hall, the great gate, those were stone, and stone does not burn. But the private floor, the rooms where the family actually lived, had been fitted out across 2 centuries with paneling and hangings and carpets and shelves of paper, and all of it laid over timber floors and timber joists that had been seasoning slowly since before any of us were born. A fire that started in that wing did not crawl. It ran. It found the old varnish and the dry wool, and it went along the ceilings faster than a man could walk. And it had started, we would learn later, in the worst possible place, a storeroom off the nursery corridor, where a lamp had been left too near a stack of folded winter drapes. No one's crime, no one's cruelty, just a small carelessness on a still afternoon, the kind of thing that happens 10,000 times and comes to nothing, until the one time it comes to everything. Prince Bram had been put down for his afternoon rest in the nursery at the end of that corridor. His nurse, a steady woman named Goodwife Tamsin, had stepped 2 doors down to fetch a fresh jug of water. She was gone perhaps 90 seconds. When she came back into the corridor, the storeroom door was standing open and the corridor was full of smoke to the height of her shoulders, and between her and the nursery door was a wall of heat she could not walk through. She told me all this afterward, sitting on the forecourt stones with her hands shaking, and she said the thing that will stay with me until I am old. I called his name and he answered me, Owen. He answered me, and I could not reach him. She could not reach him, but Halvard could. By the time I had the forecourt cleared and looked back up at the wing, the whole upper floor of that end was a moving orange thing behind the windows, and the smoke was pouring out of 2 of them now, and I could hear the fire, a low continuous roar with sharp cracks inside it, the sound of a great house eating itself. And I remember standing there with the gate rope in my hands and thinking, with a cold that had nothing to do with the season, no one is coming out of that. The king came out onto the balcony of the state floor, which was still safe, and I saw him grip the stone rail, and I saw his mouth make the shape of a name, and even from the forecourt I knew whose name it was. King Alaric was not a young man, and I had never in my service seen his face do what it did in that moment. The whole careful mask of a monarch fall off it, and leave only a grandfather looking up at a window full of fire. Around him the palace came apart into its 2 natures, the way it always does in a crisis. Some ran the right way. The steward organized the household into a chain from the well. The stable hands dragged out the long hooks and the wet sacking. Goodwife Tamsin, who had been driven back down the stair, tried 3 times to go up again and had to be held. And some ran the wrong way, toward their own safety and their own advantage, and I will name one of them now because she earned it. Queen Consort Morwenna came down the safe stair with her jewel case under her arm and her ladies around her, and when the steward called to her to help direct the household, she looked at the smoke and she said, in a voice I heard clearly across the forecourt, "The wing is lost. It is madness to send anyone up there. Let the fire watch deal with it when they come. Let the fire watch deal with it when they come." As though a 6-year-old could hold his breath for the quarter hour it would take them to come. As though the arithmetic of the thing were not written plainly in the smoke. I have thought since that there are 2 kinds of people, and a fire sorts them faster than anything else in the world. The kind who ask what can still be saved, and the kind who ask what is already lost. Morwenna had done her sum and closed her ledger. Bram was on the wrong side of it. But Halvard was already inside, and Halvard's arithmetic was different. He told me later, much later, when he could tell it, what those first minutes were. He had gone up the east stair 2 at a time and turned into the nursery corridor and met the smoke, and he had done the thing he had been drilled to do 30 years before in a life none of us knew he had lived. He had dropped to his hands and knees below the worst of it, where a thin skin of breathable air still lay along the floor, and he had gone forward on the cold stone under the heat. He could not stand. He could barely see. He went by memory and by touch, one hand on the wall, counting the doors, the linen press, the schoolroom, the storeroom that was the throat of the fire, and that he had to crawl past close enough to feel it blister the back of his glove. And then the last door, the nursery, at the very end. And behind it a small voice. He said he heard it before he reached it. He said that was the thing that carried him the last of the way when his own body was telling him to turn back. A child's voice, coughing, calling the only 2 words a frightened 6-year-old knows to call. Not help, not fire. Just over and over, thinner each time, I'm here, I'm here. The nursery door was shut, and that shut door was the one mercy in the whole afternoon, because a shut door slows a fire, and the fire had not yet come all the way down the corridor to it. Halvard got the door open and got inside and got it shut behind him again, and for a moment he said this quietly, and I believed it. For a moment inside that small room it was almost quiet, the roar muffled by the wall, and there in the corner, pressed into the gap between the bed and the wall with his blanket pulled up over his mouth, the way some instinct older than teaching had told him to, was Prince Bram. The boy was alive. He was frightened past crying, which is the worst kind of frightened in one so small, gone still and wide-eyed and silent. And when the big man in the red tunic came out of the smoke and knelt down in front of him, the prince did not run and did not scream. He looked at Halvard, the guardsman he had passed 100 times on the stair and never once heard speak, and he said, in that small ruined voice, "You are the quiet one." "I am," Halvard told him. "I have come to take you to your grandfather." Down in the forecourt we knew none of this. We knew only that the fire watch had not yet come, that the smoke had blackened, that the king was on the balcony with his knuckles white on the rail, and that the whole world had shrunk to one window and one question. The steward's water chain was doing nothing against a fire that size. You might as well spit at a forge. The stable master had gotten a long ladder up against the corridor wall, but the heat coming off the stone drove back anyone who tried to climb it. We stood in that helpless roar and we waited, and waiting is the cruelest duty there is. And Morwenna, at the edge of it all with her jewel case, said the second thing I will always hold against her. A young footman, no more than 17, had started up the stone stair meaning to go and help however he could, and she caught his sleeve and pulled him back and said, "Do not be a fool. It is one guardsman and one child. Do not throw a third life after them. One guardsman and one child." She said it the way a merchant writes off a bad debt. And the footman, bless him, pulled his sleeve out of her hand and went up anyway. And it was he who would be at the top of the ladder when the moment came, and it was he who first saw the red tunic in the smoke. Because Halvard was coming out. But he was not coming out the way he had gone in, and that is the part of the story I have to tell carefully, because the whole kingdom later shrank it down to a single bright picture, the guard emerging with the child in his arms, and the truth was longer and harder and cost more than any single picture can hold. When Halvard opened that nursery door to leave, the corridor was gone. In the 2 minutes he had spent crawling to the boy, the fire had come down the last of the passage and taken the storeroom ceiling and dropped a burning weight of timber across the way he had come. The route back down the east stair, the way he had climbed, no longer existed. He crouched in the doorway with the prince pressed against his chest and looked at a wall of fire where a corridor had been. And he understood, with the flat clarity of a man who has been in bad places before, that the door he came in by was now a door out of the world. So he shut it again. He shut himself and the boy back into the nursery, and he leaned his back against it, and he made himself think. I have asked him since what he felt in that moment, and he has never given me a dramatic answer, because he is not a dramatic man. He said, "I felt the same thing I always feel when a plan dies. I felt for the next plan." And he found it because 30 years before, in the life none of us knew, he had been taught that a room with one door is never truly a room with one door, that there is always the way you did not think of first. He put the boy down for a moment gently and told him to keep the blanket over his mouth, and he went to the window. The nursery window looked down on the walled kitchen garden, the wrong side of the wing entirely from where the ladder stood, the side no one was watching because no one expected a man to come out there. Below it, 1 floor down, was the sloped slate roof of the old scullery, a lean-to structure built against the wing a century after the wing itself, and below that the soft turned earth of the winter beds. It was not a way out. It was a chance at a way out, which in a burning building is a different and more precious thing. A drop to a slate roof, a slide, a second drop to dug ground. For a grown man alone it would have been a gamble. For a grown man carrying a 6-year-old it was very nearly madness. But the corridor was fire and the window was a chance, and Halvard had spent his whole life learning to tell the difference between the two. He could not open the window, it was an old sash, painted shut by generations of careless decorators. So he took off his greatcoat, wrapped it round his forearm, and put his elbow through the glass. And here is a small thing that tells you everything about the man. Before he broke it, he turned the boy away and covered him, so that not one splinter of that glass would reach the child. In a burning room with the smoke coming under the door with his own lungs failing him, the first thing he thought of was the glass and the boy's skin. He has never once mentioned that detail himself. I had it from the prince, years later, who remembered it the way children remember the one kindness in a terrible hour. The glass went. The smoke, which had been gathering at the ceiling, found the new opening and began to pour out over their heads, which bought them air. And Halvard knelt down and spoke to the prince in the plain, level voice he used for everything, the voice that did not change whether he was ordering a footman off a stair or telling a terrified boy how they were going to live. "Bram," he said, "I am going to carry you out of this window and down onto a roof and then down onto the ground, and it is going to be frightening, and it is going to be quick, and I need one thing from you. I need you to hold on to me and not let go, no matter what you see or hear. Can you do that one thing?" And the boy, 6 years old, choking, terrified, looked up at him and said, "Will you let go of me?" "No," said Halvard. "Then I won't let go of you," said the prince. He told me that was the moment he stopped being afraid. Not because the danger was any less. The danger was worse by the second, but because a job had a shape now, and a man can do a job with a shape when he cannot do a formless terror. He bound the boy to his chest with the belt of his tunic, and the strap of his rifle cinched tight so that both his arms would be free for the climb, and he turned Bram's face into his collarbone so the child would not see the drop, and he put one leg over the sill. The first drop to the slate roof went as he had hoped and better than he deserved. He landed hard and rolled to spread the fall, taking all of it on his own back and shoulder, curling round the boy the way a hand curls round a flame in the wind, so that the whole weight of both of them came down on Halvard and none of it on the child. Slate is not made to be landed on. It broke under him, and he slid, and where it broke it cut, and by the time he caught himself on the scullery stone coping the back of his tunic was torn, and there was a red darkness spreading through the wool that I will not describe further than to say the roof had taken its price, and Halvard paid it without a sound, because the boy was still whole and still holding on, and that was the only sum that mattered. The second drop was worse, because he could no longer trust the arm he had landed on. He went off the scullery coping into the winter beds with the boy clutched to him and the useless side held stiff, and the dug earth, soft as it was, still knocked the last of the good air out of him. And for a few seconds the boy told me this, because Halvard himself remembers nothing of it. For a few seconds the guard lay in the kitchen garden with the prince on his chest and did not move at all, and Bram, 6 years old, patted his face and said, "You said you would not let go," and Halvard, from somewhere very far down, said, "I did not." Then he got up. That is the sentence that always stops me when I tell this. Then he got up. A man with a torn back and a wrong hanging arm and no breath in his body, in a garden nobody was watching, with a fire above him and a child bound to his chest. He got his knees under him, and then his feet, and he walked. Not toward the forecourt, where the crowd and the ladder and the safety were, because between him and the forecourt lay the burning wing. Away from it, around the long way, through the kitchen garden gate and along the outer wall, the whole cold length of the palace's blind side, carrying the prince, staying on his feet by an act of will that I do not have a word for. Which is why when the footman at the top of the ladder screamed, "There, there," and pointed, he was not pointing at the ladder or the window at all. He was pointing away round the corner of the wing, to the garden gate, where a figure in a ruined red tunic had just come through, walking slowly and very straight, with a small pair of arms locked around his neck. And the forecourt fell silent. I have used those words carefully because they are the words the whole kingdom used afterward, and most people who use them do not know what they mean. They think it means the crowd was quiet. It was not quiet. A crowd is never quiet. What happened was stranger, and I have only felt it 2 or 3 times in my life. Several hundred people all making noise, all stopped making noise in the same half-second, as if one breath had been drawn out of all of them at once. And into that sudden vacuum came the only sounds that were left, which were the fire, and the guard's boots on the gravel, and a small voice saying, muffled against the wool, "I held on." Nobody moved. For one heartbeat, too, the whole forecourt simply looked at the impossible thing that had come round the corner of a building everyone had already given up for a grave. And then the silence broke all at once, and everything happened together. The king was off the balcony, and down the state stair faster than his years should have allowed. The steward and 3 guardsmen ran for Halvard. Goodwife Tamsin made a sound I will never forget and ran with her arms already out. And I dropped the gate rope I had been holding uselessly for a quarter of an hour, and I ran too, because the man in the middle of all that running was my friend, and he was still walking, and I did not think he could walk much further. He made it as far as the middle of the forecourt. He made it into the open, into the light, into the eyes of everyone who had written him and the boy off, including, I made very sure to notice, Morwenna, who had stopped at the edge of the crowd with her jewel case still under her arm and her face doing something complicated that I will come back to. And there, in the middle of the forecourt, with the whole house of Harrogate converging on him, Sergeant Halvard Renne went down onto one knee. But he did not fall. That is the distinction that later divided the whole account of that day into truth and legend, and I want it on the record from a man who was 6 feet away. He did not collapse. He knelt, a controlled, deliberate lowering, the last disciplined act of a disciplined man, and he did it so that, when he let the boy go, the child would step down onto his own 2 feet from a height of inches and not be dropped. He knelt to deliver the prince gently to the ground. And only when Bram's small shoes were flat on the gravel, and the boy's hands had been pried loose from his neck by Tamsin's shaking fingers, and the king himself had reached them and gathered the child up into his arms, only then, with the boy safe and lifted and weeping into his grandfather's shoulder, did Halvard let himself stop holding himself up. He did not speak. He had no breath to speak with. He knelt in the gravel with his ruined back and his wrong arm and his emptied lungs, and he looked up at the king holding the living grandson, and something passed between the 2 men that I will not pretend to translate. And then his eyes closed, and he pitched sideways into my arms, and I lowered him the rest of the way to the ground, and I heard myself saying his name over and over the way you say a thing you are afraid you will not get to say again. The fire watch came at last. 4 minutes after they were no longer needed to save a life, and just in time to save the wing. They flooded the east end and beat the fire back off the roof, and by dusk it was black and dead and steaming, and the east wing stood scorched but standing, and the whole disaster shrank in the telling to a burned floor and a story. But at the moment the fire watch's horses came clattering through the gate, no one on that forecourt was looking at the fire anymore. Everyone was looking at the 2 people lying in the gravel, a king on his knees with a coughing boy against his chest, and a guardsman flat on the stones with a young footman's coat balled under his head, and my hands pressed against the worst of the harm on his back. I need to tell the next part plainly, because it is where the story could have gone wrong, and where one person tried very hard to make it go wrong. The prince was hurt, but not badly and not lastingly. That was the whole point of everything Halvard had done, and I will say it now so that no one reading this fears otherwise. Bram was going to be all right. He had breathed smoke, and it had scared him past speaking for a while, and the physicians kept him abed for 3 days with a steaming kettle by his bed and watched his breathing through 2 anxious nights. But he had not been burned. He had not been cut. He had not been dropped. The one splinter of glass that reached him was on the back of his hand, no worse than a kitchen scratch, and it healed in a week, and years later he would show it to me as if it were a medal. Everything that could have happened to that child had happened instead to the man who carried him. That was not luck. That was a choice, made over and over in a burning room and off a breaking roof and in a blind garden, the choice to put every ounce of the harm onto himself and none of it onto the boy. It is the plainest thing I know, and it is the whole of what a guard is for. Halvard was another matter. Halvard did not wake up in the forecourt. He did not wake up when they carried him in on a door taken off its hinges, and he did not wake up when the physicians cut the ruined tunic off his back and went to work by lamplight. and for the length of one very long night, the palace held 2 vigils at once, one over a small prince who would live, and one over the guard who had made sure of it and might not. I sat outside the physician's door for the whole of that night, and I will not set down here what I heard through it, because the man deserves his privacy, and because the niche of harm he had taken is not the point. The point is the door stayed shut a long time, and when it finally opened near dawn, the physician who came out was gray with tiredness, but he said the word I had been praying for, which was living, and then he said the word I had feared, which was if, and the if hung over Halvard Renne for 11 days. But this is not, in the end, a story about whether the guard lived. He lived. I will not keep you in suspense over a good man's life, the way the fire kept me. This is a story about what people did while it was uncertain, and about who, in the 11 days that the palace did not know whether its bravest man would open his eyes again, tried to steal the meaning of what he had done, and how she failed. Because within an hour of Halvard being carried inside, before the physicians had even finished, Morwenna began to build a different afternoon. I saw the first bricks of it laid with my own eyes. She had recovered herself, she always recovered herself, and she moved through the shocked household gathering the frightened and the impressionable, and to each of them she said a version of the same thing, delivered in the low, sorrowing, reasonable voice she saved for occasions when she wished to be quoted. How reckless he was, she said. How near he came to losing the child. One does not run into a fire on impulse. One waits for the men trained for it. It is a mercy the boy survived the guardsman's rashness. If I had been listened to, if that hot-headed man had waited the quarter hour for the fire watch as I urged, the prince would have been carried out safely by professionals, and we should not now have a half-dead guard and a burned wing and a household in hysterics. And she would touch the listener's arm and shake her head and add, softest of all, I only ever wanted the child kept safe. It grieves me that no one heard me. It was a masterwork, and I hated it, and I understood it. She could not deny that Halvard had saved the boy. Too many people had seen the red tunic come round the corner. So she was not denying it. She was reframing it. She was turning the rescue into a reckless gamble that had merely happened to succeed, and turning her own refusal to help into prudent caution that had merely happened to be ignored. In her account, the villain of the afternoon was not the person who had said, "Let the wing burn with the child in it." The villain was the person who had run into the wing to get him. She was rewriting the fire so that the coward came out wise and the hero came out rash, and she had 3 years of practice at being believed, and the man who could contradict her was lying behind a shut door with an asterisk if asterisk over him. And it might have worked. I want to be honest about that. In those first raw hours, with everyone frightened and no one thinking straight, and the one witness whose word carried weight, the guard himself, unable to speak, her version had room to grow. I heard it come back to me second-hand by nightfall, already changed in the retelling, already a little truer sounding. They say the guard nearly got the boy killed. That is how a lie of that kind moves. It does not need to be believed all at once. It only needs to be repeated by people who were not there, until it is the shape the story remembers. There were 3 things Morwenna did not count on. The first was the boy. The second was the footman. And the third was that the king, whatever else grief had done to him that day, had not stopped being able to count. Let me take them in order, because the unmaking of a lie is as much a craft as the making of one, and it deserves to be told with the same care. The boy came first, and the boy came fastest, because a child does not know he is supposed to be discreet. On the second morning, when the physicians finally let the king bring Prince Bram down to the physic room to sit for a few minutes by the bed where Halvard lay, still not woken, still under the asterisk if asterisk, the boy did not understand that the guard could not hear him. He climbed up on the stool beside the bed, and he looked at the pale, bandaged, unmoving man, and he began to talk to him, the way children talk to the sick and the sleeping and the dead, with a complete and shattering plainness. And the king stood in the doorway, and I stood behind the king, and Princess Alara stood behind me, and we all heard a 6-year-old give the true account of the fire that no adult in the palace had yet dared give. "You came out of the smoke," Bram told the sleeping man, "and you said you had come to take me to my grandfather, and you did not shout, and the door was gone so we could not go the way you came, and you broke the window with your arm and you turned me round so the glass would not get me, and you asked me to hold on and not let go no matter what, and I asked would you let go of me and you said no, and we went off the roof and it broke and you went underneath so it would not hurt me. And you fell in the garden and I thought you were asleep, and I patted your face and you said you had not let go, and then you got up. You got up. And you carried me all the way round the long way because the fire was the short way, and you knelt down so my feet could reach the ground, and then you went asleep. Please wake up. You said you would take me to my grandfather, and you did, and I would like to say thank you, but you are asleep." There was not a dry eye in that room, and I will not pretend mine were dry either. But more than that, I watched the king's face while his grandson spoke, and I saw the last of Morwenna's afternoon come apart on it. Because a child of 6 does not construct. He does not spin. He reports. And what he reported in his small, exact voice was not a reckless gamble that happened to succeed. It was a series of deliberate, disciplined, self-sacrificing choices, each one made to put the harm on the man and keep it off the boy, the turned shoulder at the window, the body under the boy on the roof, the long way round to keep the fire away from him. No one who heard that account could ever again believe the word *reckless. Recklessness does not turn a child's face away from broken glass. Recklessness does not go underneath. The king knelt down by the stool and gathered the boy against him and did not trust himself to speak for a while. When he did, it was very quiet, and it was not to the boy. It was to me without turning his head. "Guardsman Furrers," he said, "you will bring me the footman, the young one, the one who went up the stair." So the footman came second. His name was Perrin, and he was 17, and he was so frightened of the room he had been summoned to that he could barely get his boots to carry him across it. But the king put him at his ease with the particular gentleness that great men keep for frightened young ones, and he asked Perrin to tell him, plainly and without fear, everything he had seen from the moment he started up the stair. And Perrin, bless the boy twice, told him. He told him about the smoke and the ladder and the heat off the stone. And then he told him the thing that mattered, the thing he had not known mattered until he saw the king lean forward to hear it. "There was a lady, sire," Perrin said, looking at his boots, "when I went to start up the stair. She caught my sleeve and she pulled me back and she said I was not to be a fool, that it was only one guardsman and one child, and I was not to throw a third life after them. And I pulled away and went up anyway, and I am glad I did, because I was the one at the top of the ladder and I was the one who saw him come round the corner. And if I had listened to the lady, I would not have seen it and I would not have been able to point, and it took them longer to reach him as it was." He swallowed. "I did not know it was wrong to say a child was only a child, sire, but it felt wrong. It felt wrong when she said it, and it feels wrong now." The king asked him, in a voice from which every trace of warmth had been carefully removed, to repeat the exact words the lady had used. And Perrin, trembling, repeated them. "It is only one guardsman and one child. Do not throw a third life after them." "And do you know," the king asked, "the name of the lady who said those words to you?" Perrin looked up and looked terrified and told the truth, because he had already learned in the space of one fire that the truth was the only thing worth being afraid for. "It was the Queen Consort, sire," he said. "It was Her Majesty. She said not to throw a third life after them. And I have thought about it every hour since, because a child is not a life you throw after. A child is the life you go and get. A child is the life you go and get." A 17-year-old footman said that in a physic room to a king, over the bed of a sleeping guard, and I have never in the years since heard anyone in that whole gilded court say a truer or a plainer thing. And I watched the king rise slowly to his feet, and I watched the grief on his face harden, very quietly, into something that was not grief at all. He had the boy's account and he had the footman's account, and now he did the third thing that Morwenna had not counted on. He began to count. He counted the minutes. That was the thing no one else had thought to do in all the noise and grief, and it was the thing that turned the whole matter past any hope of Morwenna's reframing. The king sent for the timekeeper's record from the West Tower, the log the bell-ringer kept, and for the fire watch's own record of when they had received the alarm and when their horses had reached the gate. And he laid the two records side by side on the table by Halvard's bed, and he counted, with the cold arithmetic of a man who had once commanded soldiers before he ever wore a crown. The smoke had shone at the window at 11 minutes past 3. The fire watch had reached the forecourt at 34 minutes past 3, 23 minutes. And the king looked up from the two papers and said to the room in a voice like a closing door, 23 minutes. That is how long the fire watch took, doing everything right, coming as fast as men and horses can come. My grandson was in that nursery with the corridor already burning. He had not 23 minutes. He had perhaps 6. He set the papers down. I am told a wise course would have been to wait for the men trained for it. I have just been told, by the timekeeper and the fire watch's own hand, that waiting for the men trained for it would have cost me the boy by 17 minutes. So I would be glad to know. And here his eyes moved slowly to the doorway where Morwenna had come to stand, drawn by the gathering, wearing her sorrowing face. I would be glad to know who has been going about my household calling the one course that saved the child a piece of recklessness, and who has been calling the delay that would have killed him prudence. The physic room went very still. Morwenna did not lose the room. I have to grant her that even now. She stood in the doorway with the arithmetic of the fire laid bare on the table beside her husband and the whole account of her afternoon collapsing, and she did not flinch, and she did not retreat. She simply changed her ground, the way she always changed her ground, smooth as water finding the next low place. "My love," she said, coming into the room, "you are ill and you are frightened and you have been sitting up over this poor man for 2 nights, and grief is telling you to find someone to be angry at, and some small, unkind person has been carrying you tales. Of course the guard was brave. I have never said otherwise. I only said in the terror of the moment, as any of us might say a foolish thing in terror, that I feared for a third life. I feared for that boy who ran up the stair. Was that so wicked? To fear that a young footman might die too. You have taken a frightened woman's frightened words and let some enemy of mine sharpen them into a weapon." She reached the bed, and she looked down at Halvard, and she arranged her face into tenderness. "Reward the guard by all means. Reward him richly. He has earned it. But do not, I beg you, let your fear turn a household against its queen on the word of a stable boy and a child of 6. It was very good. Coming from a well woman to a well man, it might even have held. But the king was ill, and being ill had done something to him that Morwenna had not weighed. It had stripped the patience out of him, the long diplomatic patience that had let her manage him for years. A sick man has no energy to spare for a lie he has already seen through. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said the thing that I believe she never forgave and never forgot, and he said it quite gently, which made it worse. "Morwenna," he said, "I did not say the words to a footman, you did. I did not stand in a forecourt with a jewel case and tell the steward the wing was lost and no one should go up. You did. I am not taking a frightened woman's frightened words and sharpening them. I am setting them beside the timekeeper's log, and they fit it exactly. You were not frightened for a third life. You had already decided the first 2 were spent. And the difference between us, my dear, the difference that this fire has made very plain, is that when the smoke showed at that window, you counted what was lost, and a guardsman counted what could still be saved. I have lived beside your arithmetic for 6 years and called it caution. I will not call it caution over the body of the man who did the other kind." He turned away from her, back to the bed, back to Halvard. "Go and rest," he said, not unkindly, and it was a dismissal that everyone in the room understood, and Morwenna understood it best of all. She went, And I want this understood because it is what kept the next days from being simple. She did not go beaten. She went to think. I saw her face as she turned in the doorway, and it was not the face of a woman who has lost. It was the face of a woman who has been told the front door is closed and is already walking round the house looking for a window. She had one card left, and it was a strong one, and I did not see it until she played it. The card was this: the king was ill, and the king was old, and the king could not sit at every bedside and count every log forever. And in the ordinary running of a great household, while a monarch is confined to his rooms, a great deal of power flows quietly to his consort, the ordering of the staff, the granting and withholding of positions, the small daily authority over who is employed and who is dismissed. Morwenna could not touch the truth of the fire. The boy had spoken it, and the footman had confirmed it, and the timekeeper had proved it, and there was no unspeaking it. But she could touch the man. She could not make Halvard a coward. But she could make him gone. And on the 9th day, while Halvard still lay under his asterisk if asterisk, and the king had exhausted himself and been ordered back to his own sickbed by physicians who feared for him too, Morwenna made her move against the man she could no longer make a villain. She could not attack his courage, so she attacked his conduct. It came as a formal complaint, laid before the household office in proper form, and it was, I have to admit, cleverly built to look like procedure and not spite. Sergeant Halvard Renne, it noted, had on the day of the fire abandoned his assigned post at the base of the east stair without a relief, and without an order from a superior officer. He had commandeered other guardsmen, myself among them, off their own posts. He had broken a window and damaged crown property. He had, in the strict letter of the standing orders, committed no fewer than 4 disciplinary breaches, any one of which was grounds for dismissal from the king's guard. And the complaint asked, in the gravest and most reasonable language, that in the interest of good order the sergeant be suspended from the guard pending a formal inquiry into his conduct. An inquiry that could, of course, take months, and that would end, if she had her way, with a brave man quietly stripped of the only life he had ever had, dismissed not for cowardice, but for the far more unanswerable crime of having saved a child without filling out the correct form first. It was diabolical, and it was legal, and with the king too ill to intervene and the household afraid of her, it very nearly worked. I have kept, all these years, a copy of that complaint, because I never want to forget how close the truth came to being defeated not by a bigger lie but by the fine print. She had learned she could not make the kingdom believe Halvard was a coward, so she set out to make the kingdom's own rules do to him what the lie could not. For 2 days it looked as though the rules would obey her. The household office received the complaint, and because it was in proper form, they were bound to act on it. And because the king was confined and the matter was disciplinary and not royal, it fell within the consort's sphere. A notice of suspension was drawn up. It required only a seal, and I want to describe the mood in the guardroom in those 2 days, because it was the lowest point of the whole affair, lower even than the night of the asterisk if asterisk. We had watched our friend nearly die to save the boy, and we had watched the truth of it fought for and won at the king's own bedside. And now we watched the reward for it take shape as a piece of paper that would put him out of the guard the moment he could stand, if he ever stood. Some of the younger guardsmen wanted to refuse duty. Some wanted to go to the newspapers, which would have been a disaster. I talked them down, and I did not have much to talk them down with, because in the strict letter of it she was right. Halvard had left his post. He had broken the window. The rules he had broken were real rules, and a man who lives by discipline cannot pretend that rules stop mattering the moment they become inconvenient. That was the trap. She had built it out of the very thing that made him what he was. What broke the trap was the person Morwenna had never once, in all her years at court, been able to move. Princess Adela was the king's younger sister, and if you want to understand her, understand this. She had spent 40 years at that court declining to be managed. She had no throne and wanted none, no faction and needed none. She had a small dry voice and a memory like a ledger and an absolute, incorruptible clarity about the difference between what was correct and what was right, and she was the one member of the House of Harrogate that Morwenna's warmth slid off of like rain off slate. She had loved the late Queen Isolde. She loved the boy Bram fiercely. And when word of the suspension notice reached her, brought, as it happens, by a footman named Perrin, who had decided that having told the truth once he might as well make a career of it, Adela put down her tea and asked one question, and then rose and went to the household office herself. The question she asked Perrin was, on the day of the fire, was the child in danger of his life? And Perrin said yes. And Adela said, then that is the only fact this office needs, and I will go and remind them of it. She arrived at the household office as the clerk was preparing the seal, and she did not raise her voice, because she never raised her voice, and she asked to see the complaint, and she read it through once slowly, and then she laid it down on the clerk's desk and delivered the ruling that ended the whole business, though it took a public reckoning still to come to make it stick. I was not there, but Perrin was, and the clerk was, and both told it the same way, so I trust it. This complaint, Adela said, asks you to suspend a man of the king's guard for abandoning his post, commandeering his fellows, breaking a window, and damaging crown property. Every fact in it is true, and every fact in it is answered by a single circumstance that the complaint has been very carefully written to leave out, that there was a 6-year-old child in a burning room, and that the post he abandoned, the men he commandeered, the window he broke, and the property he damaged were all, every one, spent in the single purpose of reaching that child before the fire did. You cannot cite the means and hide the end. A post abandoned to save the king's grandson is not a post abandoned. It is a post fulfilled, because the whole and entire purpose of a king's guard is the protection of the king's blood, and a man who stood at the base of a stair and let a child burn in order to keep his standing orders would not be a good guardsman. He would be a monument to the failure of everything a guardsman is for. She tapped the paper once with one finger. I know who wrote this. I know why. And I will tell you what you will do. You will not seal this. You will file it, and you will keep it, because it is going to be needed, not as a charge against the guard, but as evidence against the person who, having failed to make the kingdom believe a brave man was a coward, tried to have the kingdom's own rules do her spite for her. Now put away your seal, and send for me the moment the sergeant wakes. I mean to be there. And on the 11th day, the sergeant woke. I was with him when it happened, because I had taken to sitting the night watches by his bed the way I had once stood the night watches at the gate. It seemed the same duty, only warmer. It was the gray hour before dawn, and I was half asleep in the hard chair, and I heard him say, in a cracked whisper, the first words he had spoken in 11 days. The boy, he said. Did I get the boy out? Not am I dying, not what happened to me asterisk, not even where am I asterisk. 11 days under the asterisk if asterisk, and the first thought that surfaced through all of it was the boy. I leaned over him and I said, you got him out, Halvard. He is whole and well, and he has been asking after you every day. You got him out. And I watched something go out of the man's face, not consciousness, but the last of attention I had not even known he was carrying, some deep-held brace that a man carries into a fire and does not put down until he is told the thing he went in for is safe. He closed his eyes again, but differently this time, and his breathing changed, and the physician, when I fetched him, said the word that undid 11 days of the other one. He said, mending. The news that Sergeant Renne had woken and would live went through the palace like the first warm day after a winter, and it reached 3 people in 3 very different ways. It reached the boy, who wept and demanded to be taken to say thank you, and was allowed at last to do it. It reached the king, who was well enough by then to walk, and who came to the bedside and did a thing no one there had ever seen a monarch do, which was to take a guardsman's hand in both of his and hold it and say nothing at all, because some debts are past the reach of words, and both men knew it. And it reached Morwenna, who understood, the moment she heard it, that the witness she had counted on staying silent was about to be able to speak, and that everything she had built in 11 days rested on his silence. So she moved to end it before he could. She went to the king, well again and therefore no longer manageable, and she made her last attempt, and it was the most brazen of all because she had run out of subtle ground. She proposed that the whole matter, the complaint, the inquiry, the guard's conduct, be quietly dropped. Let it all be forgot, she urged. The boy is safe, the guard will live, the wing will be rebuilt. Why rake over a terrible day? Let us reward the sergeant, pension him handsomely, retire him with honor, and close the book. It was dressed as mercy and generosity, and it was neither. A handsome pension and an honorable retirement would put Halvard out of the guard just as surely as a suspension, only with everyone thanking her for it, and it would close the book before anyone wrote down, in the book, what she had done. She wanted the whole thing settled quietly, precisely, because quiet was the only place her conduct could survive. And the king, who had counted the minutes and heard the boy and heard the footman and read the complaint his sister had refused to seal, looked at his wife and understood at last, completely, the whole architecture of her. The arithmetic that always asked what was lost and never what could be saved, the warmth that was a tool and the mercy that was a maneuver, and he declined. No, said King Alaric, it will not be settled quietly. It has been quiet too long, 3 years too long, if I am honest with myself, and I am trying at last to be. There will be an accounting in the open before the household, and it will be complete. And he called it for the day the sergeant was strong enough to be present, and he said it in the great audience hall, and he sent word through the whole palace that every soul who had been on the forecourt on the day of the fire was to attend, from the steward to the stable boys, and that the Queen Consort was to attend also. Not summoned as a criminal, he was too careful and too just for that, and he had, whatever she had become, once loved her. Summoned as a member of the house, to hear the day recounted in full, in daylight, with the man who had lived it able at last to speak. The accounting was held 18 days after the fire, in the great audience hall, and I have attended coronations and state funerals, and I have never seen that hall as full or as still. Halvard was not yet able to stand for long, so a chair had been set for him, which he protested and was overruled on by the king himself. He sat in it in a plain uniform, thinner than before, his back and his arms still bound beneath the wool, and he looked out at a hall full of people who had, most of them, spent 11 days hearing that he was either a hero or a reckless fool depending on who had reached them last, and he waited in the old stillness to be asked. The king did not make a speech. That was the mercy and the mastery of it. He simply had the day told in order by the people who had seen it, and he let the truth assemble itself in the open, brick by brick, until it stood too solid for anyone ever to pull down. The steward told of the smoke and the water chain. The stable master told of the ladder that could not be climbed for the heat. Goodwife Tamsin, weeping, told of the 90 seconds and the boy's voice answering her through a wall of fire she could not cross. And then Perrin the footman stood, steadier than he had any right to be at 17, and told of the stair and the ladder and the red tunic coming round the corner of a wing everyone had given up. And then, when the king asked him gently to tell the whole of what he had seen and heard, Perrin turned and looked directly at the Queen Consort and told the hall about the hand on his sleeve and the words, "It is only one guardsman and one child. Do not throw a third life after them." The hall made a sound then, low and involuntary, the sound of several hundred people all understanding a thing at once. And Morwenna sat through it with her chin up and her face still, because she was, to the last, a woman who did not lose a room, but she had lost this one, and she was too clever not to know it. Then the king turned to the boy. Prince Bram had been brought to the accounting because the king, wisely, understood that the one witness no lie could survive was a child who did not know how to lie. He was set on a chair beside his grandfather, his small legs not reaching the floor, and the king asked him, very gently, in front of the whole silent hall, to tell everyone what the guard had done in the fire. And Bram told it, the same account unchanged that he had given the sleeping man in the physic room, because it was simply what had happened, and a child does not have two versions of what happened. The turned shoulder at the window, the body under him on the roof, the long way round. You said you would not let go of me, and you did not. He told it in his clear high voice to 500 people, and when he had finished, he added one thing he had not said in the physic room. Because in the physic room the man had been asleep, and now the man was awake and sitting 15 feet away, and Bram had been waiting 18 days to say it to his face. He climbed down off his chair. No one stopped him. No one in that hall could have moved to stop him. And he crossed the open floor of the great audience chamber, past the king, past the Princess Adela, past the still and silent figure of the Queen Consort, and he walked up to the guard's chair, and he put his arms around Halvard's neck as far as they would go, and he said, so that the whole hall heard it, "Thank you for coming into the smoke to get me. I am glad it was you. I am glad it was the quiet one." And Halvard Renne, who had not broken his stillness in 11 years on the wall, who had not made a sound off the breaking roof or in the blind garden or under the physician's lamp, put one bound arm around the boy and bowed his head over the small head against his shoulder, and his composure, that great disciplined stillness that was the whole armor of the man, finally and quietly gave way, not into weakness, into something the hall had no word for and did not need one. And I looked away, because a man is owed his privacy even in a full room, and when I looked back the king was on his feet. What the king did then he did in the old form, the form the house of Harrogate kept for its gravest acts, and he did it in front of everyone so that it could never be undone in a corridor. First he settled the matter of the complaint, because he would not leave it hanging over the man like a raised hand. "It has been put to this office," the king said, "that Sergeant Renne abandoned his post, commandeered his fellows, broke a window, and damaged the property of the crown. Every word of that is true, and I rule here before all of you that not one word of it is a fault. A guard's post is not a spot on a floor. A guard's post is the king's blood, wherever it stands and wherever it is in danger. When my grandson was in that nursery, my grandson was Sergeant Renne's post, and Sergeant Renne did not abandon his post. He ran to it through fire. The stair he left, the men he took, the glass he broke, the crown property he damaged. I would give the whole east wing to the fire 10 times over for what those breaches bought. Let the complaint be struck. Let it never be raised again. And let it be recorded that the man who wrote his oath in fire kept it better than any man who ever kept it in ink." The hall did not cheer. It was too grave a room for cheering, but I felt the whole of it lean, the way a field of wheat leans all at once when the wind finds it, and I knew the truth had set. There would be no unsettling it now. It had been spoken by the king in the old form, before 500 witnesses, with the boy's arms still around the guard's neck. Then the king raised Halvard. He could not raise him to his feet. The man could barely stand. So he did the thing that made the whole account go out of that hall and across the kingdom and into the years. He came down off the dais himself, and crossed to the guard's chair, and he took from the breast of his own coat the highest honor the house of Harrogate had to give, the Cross of Valor, the decoration reserved for those who risked their lives for the crown's own, and he did not hand it to a chamberlain to pin on later in some quiet ceremony. He knelt, the King of Eldermoor knelt, on the stone floor of his own audience hall, before a wounded guardsman in a plain uniform, and he pinned the Cross of Valor to Halvard Renne's tunic with his own hands, over the place on the man's chest where a 6-year-old's arms had been bound 18 days before. And he said, quietly, but into a silence so complete that the farthest corner of the hall heard it, "You went underneath. That is all any of us needs to know of you, Sergeant, for the rest of your life and beyond it. When it broke, you went underneath. There is no higher thing a man can be." And then the king stood and turned, and there was one piece of the accounting left, and everyone in the hall knew what it was, and everyone in the hall looked at the woman who had sat through all of it with her chin up. I have thought a great deal in the years since about what the king did with Morwenna, and I have come to believe it was the wisest and the hardest thing in the whole affair. He did not have her arrested. He did not have her denounced or humiliated or dragged from the hall. He was a just man, and a just man does not answer cruelty with a spectacle of his own, and he had, whatever she had made of the years, once loved her, and a man does not unmake love with a public execution of the heart. What he did was quieter and more final than any of that. He looked at her across the length of the hall, and he said only this: "Madam, the household has heard the day recounted in full. It has heard what was said on the forecourt and to a footman on a stair, and it has heard what a guard did in answer. I will not say more of it here, but you and I will speak tonight of what changes, because a great deal changes, and it changes from this hour." And that was all. He said no more. He did not need to. Everyone in that hall understood that the Queen Consort's long reign over the small daily powers of the palace had ended in the space of one recounted afternoon. That her word would no longer move the household, that her complaints would no longer be sealed, that the tide that had run her way for 6 years had turned, all at once, over the body of a wounded man and the testimony of a child. She sat very straight and she gave no sign, but she never afterward held the power in that palace that she had held before the fire, and the change dated, everyone agreed, from that single sentence spoken across a full hall. A great deal changes, and it changes from this hour. What passed between the king and Morwenna that night is not mine to know or to set down. I know only its results, which unfolded across the following year with the quiet inevitability of a tide going out. Her family's constant presence at court thinned. The positions she had filled with her own people were, one by one, and always for some correct and unarguable reason, filled with others. The locked rooms and the withheld keys and the small daily tyrannies that had made her the true governor of the palace's inner life fell away from her, not in a single stroke but steadily, until she was what she had come to court as and had spent 6 years refusing to be, the king's wife, and no more than that, honored in public and powerless in private. Some called it mercy and some called it exile in place, and I think it was both, and I think the king intended it to be both. He had answered her the way you answer weather, not by shouting at the storm, but by closing, one at a time, every door it had been coming through. But the accounting is not where I want to end, because the accounting was the king's, and the honor was the king's, and if I ended there, I would be telling you the story the kingdom told, which is a story about a monarch's justice. The story I saw was smaller and truer, and it belonged to a guardsman, and it ended not in the great audience hall but 8 months later, on an ordinary gray morning at the base of a stair. Halvard mended slowly. The back healed, the arm was never quite what it had been, and to the end of his service he could not raise it fully above his shoulder, which meant he could no longer stand the ceremonial posts at the gate, the ones that require a man to present arms crisp and high for the cameras and the crowds. The guard offered him a pension and an honorable discharge. The same rest Morwenna had once offered as a weapon, now offered honestly as a kindness. And Halvard declined it in 4 words, the way he declined most things, which was plainly, "I am not finished," he said. So they found him the one post in the whole palace that a man with a stiff shoulder could still stand with honor, and it was, by a piece of rightness so exact that I have never been able to think of it as chance, the post at the base of the east stair, the very spot he had left to run into the fire, now guarding the rebuilt wing, and the nursery at the end of its rebuilt corridor, and the boy who slept in it. He stood that post for 9 more years, until age took him off the wall for good. And every afternoon of those 9 years, when the boy and then the growing lad, and then the young man came down that stair, he passed the quiet guard at the bottom of it, and every afternoon, without fail, without a single exception that I ever witnessed or heard of, the two of them exchanged the same 4 words, in the same order, spoken so low that most who passed never even noticed the ritual at the base of the stair. The boy would say, going up or coming down, "Don't let go." And the guard would say, "I never did." I heard it 1,000 times. I never once heard it without something turning over in my chest, because I knew what it was. It was not a game. It was a treaty between the two of them, renewed daily. A small, unbreakable promise passed back and forth across the years. The promise a terrified 6-year-old had asked for in a burning room. And the promise a bloodied man had kept off a breaking roof and through a blind garden and into the middle of a silent forecourt, and had gone on keeping quietly at the base of a stair for the rest of his working life. There is a version of this story that the kingdom tells, and it is not a false version, only an incomplete one. In that version the palace fell silent, and a bloodied guard came out of the smoke with the little prince, and a king knelt and pinned a cross of valor, and a scheming woman's power was broken, and justice was done. All of that is true. I was there for all of it, and I have set it down. But if you want the whole of it, the part the crowds did not see, the part that was never in the accounting or the honors list, it is this. A boy asked a man not to let go of him, in the worst hour either of them would ever live, and the man said he would not. And then for the rest of his life he made the promise true, over and over, in fire and off a roof, and at the bottom of a stair on 10,000 ordinary mornings. That is what a guard is. Not the tunic, not the bearskin, not the stillness the tourists photograph at the gate. A guard is a man who tells a frightened child, I will not let go of you, and then does not, no matter what breaks, no matter what it costs, for as long as he draws breath. Halvard Renne is gone now. He died old and in his bed, which is more than a man who goes underneath in a fire has any right to expect. And the prince, a grown man by then, tall and grave and kind, stood at his graveside in the gray rain and did not speak, because there was nothing left to say that the two of them had not already said 1,000 times at the base of a stair. But when the grave was filled and the others had drifted away, he stayed behind alone for a moment, and I was near enough to hear, and I heard him say it one last time to the turned earth, very quietly, the 4 words that had held between them for the whole of a life. Don't let go. And though there was no one left to answer, I swear to you the rain seemed to still for a heartbeat, the way the whole forecourt had stilled long ago, when a man in a ruined tunic came round the corner of a burning wing carrying everything that mattered. And in that heartbeat of stillness, it was as though the answer came anyway, the way it always had, plain and quiet and true, from a man who had proven with his own body that he meant it. I never did.